The Traveling Companion by Hans Christian Andersen. Poor Johannes was miserable. His father was ill, and there was no hope of his recovering. It was late in the evening. They were all alone together. The lamp on the table was burning low. "You have been a good son," whispered the father. "I'm sure that God will help you and protect you." The dying man looked kindly and earnestly at his son. Then he breathed very deeply and died. He looked as if he were asleep. Johannes wept, for now he was alone in this world. He had neither father or mother, nor brother or sisters. He knelt down and kissed his father's hand. Many a tear ran down his cheeks before he finally fell asleep with his head resting against the hard board of the bedstead. He dreamed a strange dream, in which the sun and moon curtsied before him. He saw his father, too, alive and well. He heard him laugh, as he always did whenever something amused him. And a lovely girl, with long, beautiful hair and a golden crown on her head, took his hand in hers, and his father said to him, "This is your bride, the most beautiful girl in the world." Then he woke. The dream was over. His father was dead. There he lay, his cold body. He was all alone. Poor Johannes. Next week his father was buried. Johannes walked behind the coffin. He could no longer see his father, whom he loved so much. He heard the earth fall on the coffin lid. He peered down into the grave. He could see the corner of the burial chest. Another shovel full of earth, and that, too, was out of sight. At that moment, Johannes felt that his heart would break from sorrow. A psalm was sung, and it sounded so beautiful that he burst out crying, and the tears relieved his grief. The sunlight played on the leaves of the trees. It was as if the sun wanted to say, "Do not be sad, Johannes. Can't you see how beautiful the sky is? Your father is up there, and he's begging God to help, so that all may go well for you." "I will try always to be good," thought Johannes. "Then I too will go to heaven when I die and see my father again. I will have so much to tell him, and he will teach me about all the beautiful things in heaven, as he taught me about all the beautiful things here on earth. Oh, how wonderful it will be." For a moment, as the words became quite a picture in Johannes's mind, he smiled, though the tears ran down his face. The little birds in the chestnut tree sang. They were happy even though they were attending a funeral. Or maybe they were happy because they knew that the dead man now had wings more beautiful than theirs. For he had been good while he lived on earth. Johannes saw how the little birds flew from the branches of the tree far out into the world, and he wanted to fly with them. But first, he must carve a wooden cross to put on his father's grave. In the evening, when he was finished, he returned to the churchyard and found the grave covered with sand and decorated with flowers. The people of the village had wanted to show that they, too, loved his father and felt sorrow at his death. Early the next morning, Johannes packed his few belongings into a small bundle and put his inheritance of 50 silver marks into a purse which he hid under his belt. Now he was ready to go out into the world, but first he went to his father's grave to pray and say goodbye. "I shall always be good, Father," he promised, "so that you may, without shame, bid God to protect me." As he walked across the fields, leaving the village behind him, the flowers nodded as the wind blew over them and said, "Welcome, Johannes. Welcome to our green world. Is it not beautiful?" But Johannes could not hear them. He turned to look once more at the old church where he had been baptized, and where every Sunday he had attended service with his father and sung hymns. High up in one of the little windows of the tower, he saw the church pixie with his red woolen hat. The pixie was shading his eyes with his hand. The sun was shining right in his face. Johannes waved goodbye to him, and the pixie took off his hat and swung it over his head. Then he put his hand on his heart and blew kisses toward Johannes to show that he wished him good luck and a happy journey. Johannes thought about all the beautiful things he would see in the big marvelous world as he walked on, farther and farther away from all that he knew. Soon he no longer recognized the countryside. He passed through villages and towns that he had never seen before, and all the people he met there were strangers. The first night he slept in a haystack and thought it was as fine a bed as anyone could have, that a king could not have offered him one more comfortable. The fields, the little river, the haystack, and the blue heaven above him. What a lovely bedchamber! The green grass dotted with red and white flowers was a carpet. The hedge of wild roses and the elderberry bushes were better than bouquets of flowers in vases. And the river, with its clear water, was his washing basin. The reeds that grew along its edge nodded to say both good morning and good night to him, and the moon was an excellent night lamp that couldn't set fire to the curtains. Here Johannes could sleep peacefully, and he did, and only woke after the sun had risen and all the little birds started singing, "Good morning, good morning. Aren't you up yet?" The bells rang from the church tower. It was Sunday. The people were going to church, and Johannes went too. He sang a hymn and listened to the minister preach. Everything was just as it was in the church where he had been baptized and attended service with his father. In the churchyard there were many graves where the grass grew high, for there was no one to tend to them. Johannes thought of his own father's grave, which soon would look like these, now that he was not there to weed and plant flowers on it. He pulled up some of the grass and straightened the wooden crosses that had fallen. Then he took the wreaths that the wind had blown from the graves and put them back where he thought they belonged, hoping that some stranger would do the same for his father's grave. Outside the church stood a beggar. Johannes gave him a silver coin and then walked on, happy and content, out into the wide, wide world. Toward evening, a storm began to gather. Johannes looked for shelter, but the landscape was bare and uninhabited. Finally, when night had already fallen, he saw a church on a hill. The door to the church was ajar. Here he would seek shelter until the storm was over. "I will just sit in the corner," he thought. "I'm tired and need some rest." He sat down, folded his hands, and said his prayers. Then he fell asleep and dreamed while the storm broke and lightning flashed and the thunder roared. When he woke, it was past midnight. The storm was over, and the moonlight shone through the windows into the church. Near the altar stood a coffin. It was open, and in it lay a dead man who was to be buried the next day. Johannes was not afraid, for he had a good conscience, and he knew that the dead cannot do any harm. It is the living, evil human beings that one has to fear. Two such worthless men were now standing before the open coffin. They wanted to harm the dead man. They were preparing to take him out of his coffin and throw him out of the church. Oh, poor dead man. "What are you doing?" cried Johannes. "It is sinful to disturb the dead. Let the poor man sleep in Jesus' name." "Nonsense," screamed one of the wicked men. "He has cheated us. He owed us money, which he couldn't pay back, and now he's died on top of it, and we shan't ever see a penny of our money again. But we shall have our revenge. We shall throw him out in front of the church door, and there he can lie like a dog." "I have only 50 marks, said Johannes. "It is my inheritance from my father. I will give it to you if you promise to let the dead man lie in peace." I can get along without money. I am strong, and God will help me." "Yes," sneered the wicked man. "If you will pay his debt, we shan't harm him." They took Johannes's money and, laughing at his goodness, went on their way. Johannes put the dead man back into his coffin, folded the cold hands, and then as happily as ever entered the dark forest just beyond the church. The moonlight shone down through the leaves of the trees, and Johannes saw the elves playing, for they did not mind his coming. They knew he was a good and innocent human being. Only from evil and dishonest people do elves hide. Some of them were no bigger than Johannes's finger. Their long yellow hair was held in place by golden combs. 2 by 2, they swung on the drops of the dew that clung to the leaves and tops of the high grass. Sometimes the dewdrops would roll down in among the grass, and oh, how the elves would laugh. Oh, it was a joy to watch them. They sang all the songs that Johannes had learned when he was a child. Colorful spiders with silver crowns on their heads spun palaces and bridges from bush to bush, which caught the dew and looked like glass in the moonlight. The elves played the whole night through. Only when the sun rose again did they climb back into their flowers. Then the wind grabbed their bridges and palaces and carried them high into the air as flying spiderwebs. Johannes had just come out of the forest when he heard someone call behind him, "Wait, where are you going?" "Out into the wide world," answered Johannes. "I'm a poor fellow who has neither father nor mother, but I'm sure that God will help me." "I want to go out into the world too," said the stranger. "Let's be traveling companions." That's a good idea," agreed Johannes, and so they went on together. It took no time for them to become fond of each other, for they were both good and kind. Johannes soon realized that the stranger was much wiser than he. He seemed to be able to talk about everything and to have been everywhere. There was hardly anything that existed that he did not know something about. The sun was high in the sky when they stopped to rest under a large tree. There they ate their lunch. Just as they were finishing, an old woman came hobbling along. Her back was bent and she had a crutch under one arm. Strapped to her back was a bundle of firewood, which she had gathered in the forest, and in her apron, which she had tied together to make a little sack, there were 3 bunches of birch switches. Suddenly, she slipped and fell. She screamed, for she had broken her leg. Oh, the poor woman. Johannes suggested that they carry her to her home, but the stranger opened his knapsack and took out a little jar. In there was a salve which he could cure her leg with, make it whole again, and well again, so that she could walk home by herself as if her leg had never been broken. As payment, he wanted the 3 bunches of birch switches she carried in her apron. "You want to be paid well," said the old woman, and nodded very strangely. She did not want to give up her switches, yet it was not pleasant to lie there on the road with a broken leg, so she gave the switches to the stranger. As soon as he had rubbed a little salve on her leg, she was up and walking better than she had before. It was an unusual salve, not the kind that you buy at a pharmacy. "What will you do with the switches?" asked Johannes. "Oh, I just took a fancy to them because I'm a strange fellow, I suppose," said the wayfarer, and they walked on in silence. "Look at those heavy dark clouds," remarked Johannes, pointing to the horizon. "We are in for a storm." "No," laughed his companion. "They are not clouds, they are mountains, beautiful, high mountains, which one can climb up into the sky where the air is always fresh. They are marvelous, believe me. Tomorrow we shall reach that far out into the wide world." But the mountains were farther away than they thought. It was the next evening before they came to the foothills. Here started the great black forest that covered most of the mountainsides. There were boulders as large as whole villages. It would not be easy to cross these mountains. Therefore, Johannes's traveling companion suggested that they stay at an inn for the night, to be fresh for the morning's climb. In the public room of the inn, a crowd had gathered. A traveling puppet theater was just about to give a performance. The spectators sat in rows facing the little stage. In the first row was a fat old butcher. He had taken the best seat, and next to him sat his dog, a ferocious-looking bulldog. The comedy began. It was a very nice play with a king and a queen in it. They sat on a throne and had golden crowns on their heads. The queen had a long dress that trailed behind her. It was expensive, but she could afford it. Wooden dolls with handlebar mustaches and glass eyes stood at the doors, opening and closing them in order to air the room. It was a lovely comedy, with nothing tragic about it at all. But just as the queen was crossing the stage, the bulldog, and God only knows what the dog was thinking, his master in any case was not holding on to him, jumped up onto the stage, grabbed the queen by her waist with his great jaws. Crunch, crack. It was a tragedy after all. The poor man who owned the puppet theater and had played all the parts was beside himself with misery. The queen was the most beautiful of all of his dolls, and now the bulldog had beheaded her. When all the rest of the audience had gone, Johannes's traveling companion said that he would repair the doll. He took out his little jar and put some salve on it. It was the same salve that had helped the poor woman with the broken leg. As soon as the salve had been smeared on the doll, she was whole again, but that was not all. The doll could move her little limbs by herself. The puppeteer was quite delighted. Now he didn't have to pull her strings anymore. The queen could dance by herself, and that was more than any of the other dolls could do. When night came and everyone at the inn had gone to bed, deep and sorrowful sighs were heard. The lamenting kept on, and finally they all got up to see what was the matter. The sighing came from the theater. The puppeteer opened the box that was also the small stage. All the wooden dolls were lying in a heap. There were the king and his followers, and it was they who were sighing so mournfully. They stared with their glass eyes out into the darkness. They wanted to be rubbed with the magic salve too, so that they would be able to move and dance like the queen. The queen kneeled down and held out her golden crown while she spoke. "Please take this in return for putting some salve on my husband and his courtiers." The puppeteer who owned the theater and all the dolls felt so sad that he cried, and promised the wayfarer that he would give him all the money he received the following night if only he would smear a little salve on 4 or 5 of the other dolls. Johannes's friend said that he cared not for money. What he wanted was the old sword that the theater director had hanging from his belt. As soon as it was given to him, he rubbed a little salve on 6 of the dolls. They started instantly to dance so prettily that all the real people who had been standing about watching them began to dance too. The coachman danced with the cook, and the waiters with the maids. The poker tried to dance with the little brass shovel that stood by the fireplace, but they didn't dance far. They fell with a clatter after they had taken their first step. It was an exciting evening. The next day, Johannes and his friend left the inn and started to climb the mountains. Upward they went through the dark forest of fir trees, until the church steeples in the valley looked like little red berries amidst the greenery below. They could see far and wide. Before them were views of dozens of places where they had not been. Johannes had never seen so much of the beautiful world all at once. The sun shone down from a cloudless blue sky. From the valleys they heard the sounds of the hunters' horns. The melody was so beautiful that tears came into his eyes, and he could not help saying out loud, "Oh God, I could kiss you for your kindness to us all, having given such a beautiful world to live in." His companion had folded his hands and was looking all over the forest and the towns. All at once they heard a strange but pleasant sound above them. They looked up. There was a great white swan, and the beautiful bird was singing as they had never heard a bird sing before. But its voice grew weaker and weaker, and finally it bent its head towards its body and fell to the ground, right at their feet. There the lovely bird lay dead. "What wonderful wings!" cried the wayfarer. "A pair of wings as wide and as large as those must be worth a lot. I shall have them. It is fortunate I have a sword." With a single stroke, he cut off both of the dead swan's wings, and now they were his. They traveled mile after mile, and yet they were still in the mountains. At last they came to a large town. More than 100 towers shone as if they were made of silver, while the sunlight played upon them. In the middle of the town, there was a great marble castle with a roof of gold, and that was where the king lived. Johannes and his friend stopped at the inn outside the walls because they wanted to wash and change their clothes before entering the city. The innkeeper told them that the king was a very kind and friendly man who never did anyone any harm, but what a daughter he had. Oh, God preserve us, she was a horrible princess. Oh, she was beautiful enough. There was no one lovelier to look at. But what good was that when she was as cruel and wicked as any witch, and had already caused the death of many a fine prince? She had proclaimed that anyone could propose to her, prince or beggar alike. She didn't care who her suitor was. All he had to do to win her hand and become king when her father died was to answer correctly 3 questions that she asked him. But if he failed, then he must have his head chopped off or be hanged. That's how heartless the beautiful princess was. Her poor old father was very sad indeed, but he could do nothing about it. For once, long ago, he had promised her never to interfere in the manner she chose a husband. Every prince who had come to woo the princess had failed to guess the correct answers to her questions, and had been either beheaded or hanged. But there was not one who had not been warned beforehand, and he need not have proposed. Still, the old king was so upset and sorry about all the suffering that once a year he spent a whole day on his knees and ordered his whole army to do the same. They prayed that the princess would become good, but she didn't. The old ladies drank schnapps, colored in black, to show that they were in mourning, and that was the most they could do. "What a horrible princess," said Johannes. "She should be switched. That is what she deserved. If I were the old king, I would beat her until I drew blood." Just at that moment, they heard the people outside shouting, "Hurrah!" The princess was riding by. She was so beautiful that anyone who looked at her forgot how wicked she was, and that's why everyone was now shouting, "Hurrah!" 12 lovely maidens in white silk dresses with golden tulips in their hands, riding on jet-black horses, were with her. The princess herself rode on a milk-white horse. Its bridle was set with rubies and diamonds. Her dress was of the purest gold, and the whip she carried in her hand looked like a sunbeam. The golden crown on her head was like the stars of heaven, and her cape was made out of thousands of butterfly wings. And yet she was far more beautiful than all of her clothes. When Johannes saw her, his face became as red as blood dripping from a wound, and he could not utter a word. The princess looked like the girl with the golden crown that he had dreamed about the night his father died. She was so beautiful, and he already loved her so much that he could not believe that she was an evil witch who ordered men to be beheaded or hanged because they could not guess the answers to the questions she asked them. Anyone can propose to her, even a poor man like me. I will go to the castle, for nothing can stop me from going, Johannes announced. Everyone begged him not to go, for they all agreed that he would fare no better than the others who had tried. Even his traveling companion advised him against it, but Johannes was not to be dissuaded. He brushed his clothes, polished his shoes, and combed his yellow hair. Then he went alone into the town and straight up to the castle. "Come in," called the old king when Johannes came knocking. Johannes opened the castle door, and the old king, wearing a dressing gown and embroidered slippers, welcomed him. The king had his golden crown on his head, his scepter in one hand, and the golden apple of state in the other. "Wait a moment," he said, while he tucked the apple under his arm so that he could shake hands with Johannes. But as soon as he heard that it was another suitor who had come, he started to cry so bitterly that both the apple and the scepter fell to the floor, and he had to dry his eyes with his dressing gown. Oh, poor old king. "Don't do it," he begged. "You will be no more fortunate than any of the others. Come and see." He led Johannes into the princess's private garden. Oh, it was a horrible sight. In every tree were the hanging bodies of 3 or 4 princes who had proposed marriage to the princess and had not been able to answer the 3 questions she asked. When the wind blew, their skeletons rattled and made such a racket that they frightened all the birds, so that none ever flew into the garden. The vines wound themselves around human bones. The grinning skulls filled the flower pots instead of flowers. Wasn't that a fine garden for a princess? "Look around you," said the king. "You will end up like all the others. So please, please don't propose to my daughter. It really makes me very unhappy. I'm very sensitive on that point." Johannes kissed the old king's hand and said that he was sure everything would be all right, for he was very much in love with the lovely princess. At that moment, the princess came riding into the castle yard, followed by all her ladies in waiting. The king and Johannes went out to greet her. How beautiful she was, as she gave Johannes her hand. Now he was even more in love than he had been before. Surely she could not be a cruel and wicked witch. They all went up into the great hall, and there the page boy served cookies and jam. But the old king was so sad that he didn't eat anything. Besides, he thought the cookies were too hard. It was decided that Johannes was to come to the castle the next morning, and there, in front of the judges and the king's council, answer the question the princess would ask. If he could answer it, then he would have to come back and answer 2 more questions on the following days. But no one, as yet, ever answered the princess' first question, so the day she asked it had been the last of their lives. Johannes was not worried or frightened about what was going to happen. He was happily dreaming about the beautiful princess. He was confident that God would help him, though he didn't know exactly how, nor did he give it much thought as he skipped through the streets on his way back to the inn where his friend was waiting for him. Johannes could not stop talking about how beautiful the princess was, and how kindly she had received him. He longed for the next day when he could see her again and try his luck at guessing the answer to her question. His friend shook his head. He was not happy. "I am very fond of you," he said. "We could have remained together a long time yet, and now I have to lose you. Poor, dear Johannes. I feel like crying, but shall not do it. It would spoil our last evening together. So let us be happy. Tomorrow, when you are gone, there will be time for my tears." The whole town had heard that the princess had a new suitor, and they all went into mourning. The theater was closed, and the little old ladies who sold candy put black crepe around their chocolate pigs. The king and all the priests went to church and prayed on their knees. Everyone was miserable, for no one believed that poor Johannes would fare better than all the other suitors had. Late in the evening, the wayfarer ordered a bowl of punch and said to Johannes that now they ought to drink to the health of the princess. When Johannes had drunk his second glass, he was so tired that he no longer could keep his eyes open and fell asleep. His friend lifted him gently from the chair and laid him on the bed. When the darkest hour of the night had almost come, Johannes's friend tied the swan's wings on his back and stuck into his pocket the largest bunch of switches that he got from the old lady for curing her leg. He opened the window and flew out over the town to the royal castle, where he landed on the balcony of the princess and hid in a corner next to her window. The clock in the tower struck the quarter before the hour. It would soon be midnight. The whole town was still. Suddenly, the princess's window opened, and out she flew, her white cape trailing behind her. On her back were a pair of large black wings. The wayfarer made himself invisible so that no one could see him. Behind the princess he flew, whipping her so hard that he drew blood. She was flying toward the big black mountain beyond the city. The wind took hold of her cape and spread it out like the sail of a ship, and the moon shone through it. "Oh, how it is hailing! How it is hailing!" moaned the princess every time the switch hit her back. Finally, when she reached the mountain, she knocked on it as if it were a door. The mountain rumbled like thunder and opened itself so the princess could enter. Right behind her was Johannes's friend, though she could not see him, for he was invisible. They were walking through a long, high corridor. The walls were lighted curiously by the glow of red spiders who ran up and down like little flames. Now they were in a great hall built of silver and gold. Along the walls was a row of blue and red flowers, as large as sunflowers. But one could not pick them, for their stems were snakes and their faces were the fire shooting out of the snakes' mouths. The ceilings were studded with glowworms and sky-blue bats whose thin, fragile wings beat constantly. What a strange sight! In the middle of the hall stood a throne, which rested on the skeletons of 4 horses. Their bridles were made of red spiders. The seat of the throne itself was milk-white glass, and the pillows were little black mice who were biting at each other's tails. Above it was a canopy, made of pink spider webs, decorated with little green flies that shone like precious stones. On the throne sat an old troll with a crown on his ugly head and a scepter in his hand. He kissed the princess on the forehead and invited her to sit down beside him on the throne. Now the music began. Big black grasshoppers played on mouth organs. Owls beat themselves on their stomachs. They were the drums. It was a funny concert. Small black trolls with jack-o'-lanterns in their hats were dancing. No one could see the wayfarer, who was standing behind the throne watching and listening to everything. The courtiers entered. They were very elegant and distinguished, but anyone who looked at them carefully could see what they really were. Cabbage heads attached to broomsticks, which the troll had made alive by witchcraft, and then dressed into beautifully embroidered robes. But they were of no importance. Courtiers are only for show. After the dancing had gone on for a while, the princess told the troll about her new suitor and asked him what question she should ask him the next morning. "Listen," said the troll. Ask him to guess what you are thinking about, and then ask about something very commonplace, because he will never guess that. Just think of your shoes, then have his head cut off. But don't forget to bring me his eyes tomorrow night. I love to eat them." The princess curtsied most humbly and said that she wouldn't forget the eyes. Then the troll commanded the mountain to open itself again, and the princess started her flight back to the castle. Johannes's friend was flying right behind her, and he beat her so severely with his switches that she moaned loudly about the terrible hailstorm and was glad when she finally reached the window of her bedchamber. The wayfarer flew back to the inn where Johannes was sleeping. He took off his wings and went to bed, for he had a right to be tired. Very early the next morning, when Johannes awoke, his friend told him that he had had a strange dream. He dreamed about the princess and her shoes. So when the princess asks you what she is thinking about, do remember to say, "Her shoes," he said. Of course, that was what he had heard the troll tell the princess that she should be thinking about. But the wayfarer did not tell Johannes about his visit to the mountain. "Well, I can just say one thing is the other," said Johannes. "And maybe you have dreamed the true answer, for I'm sure that God wants to help me. Still, I think we should say goodbye to each other, for if I guess wrong, I shall never see you again." They kissed, and Johannes went into the town and straight up to the castle. The big hall was filled with people. All the judges sat in easy chairs and had eider-down pillows on which to rest their heads, for they had grave matters to think about. The king paced the floor with a white handkerchief in his hands and constantly dried his eyes. The princess entered. She was even more beautiful than she had been the day before. She greeted everyone graciously and kindly, and took Johannes's hand in hers and said, "Good morning, dear friend." Now, Johannes had to guess what she was thinking about. She looked ever so kindly toward him, but when she heard the word shoes, her face grew as white as chalk and her body shook. She couldn't hide that Johannes had given the right answer. Glory be! How happy the old king was! He turned a somersault, and the people clapped both for him and Johannes, who had guessed the answer to the first question. Johannes's friend was pleased when he heard how well everything had gone. But Johannes folded his hands and thanked God, for he was certain that it was he who had helped him and would probably help him with the other questions. The following morning he would have to answer the second. The second evening passed just like the first. As Johannes slept, his traveling companion tied the swan's wings on his back and followed the princess. But he now brought along 2 of the bundles of switches and beat her even harder. Again, no one saw him, and he heard everything that was said. This time the princess was to think about her gloves. Early the next morning, he told Johannes that he had a dream that the princess would think of her gloves. When Johannes guessed correctly, the whole court turned somersaults as they had seen the king do the day before. But the princess had to lie down on her divan and wouldn't speak to anyone. Now everything depended on what Johannes said the next morning. If he guessed right the third time, she would have to marry him, and he would inherit the kingdom when her father died. But if he didn't, he would lose his life, and the troll would eat his pretty eyes. That evening, Johannes went to bed early, said his prayers, and slept peacefully, while the wayfarer tied the swan's wings to his back and stuck a sword in his belt, and taking all 3 bundles of switches with him, flew to the castle. It was pitch dark. There was such a storm that the tiles were blown off the roofs, and the trees in the prince's garden, in which the skeletons hung, swayed as reeds do in the wind. Every minute, the lightning flashed and the thunder roared continuously, as if it were one great thunderclap that lasted the whole night through. The window opened. The princess flew out. Her face was as white as death, but she laughed at the storm, which was not wild enough for her taste. Her white cape whirled around her like a great sail. Johannes's friend beat her so hard with the 3 bundles of birch branches that blood dripped down to the earth far below, and the princess could hardly fly. At last, she reached the mountain. "It is hailing, what a storm," she said to the troll. "I had never been out in weather like that before."
Yes, you can get too much of a good thing,"
said the troll. Now the princess told him that Johannes had guessed what she had been thinking a second time. "If he guesses right again tomorrow, then he will have won. I shall never visit this mountain again, and never be able to do one more magic thing. Oh, it's so sad."
He will not be able to guess what your thoughts are tomorrow, not unless he is a great wizard, more than I am. I shall think of something that he has never seen. Now, let us be merry."
The troll took the princess by the hand, and they danced among the little trolls and the jack-o'-lanterns. On the walls, the glowing red spiders ran up and down like tiny tongues of fire. The owls beat the drums. The crickets sang. The black grasshoppers blew on their mouth organs. It was a grand ball. They danced until it was very late, and the princess had to return or she would be missed at the castle. The troll said that he would follow her home. That would give them a little more time together. As they flew through the storm, Johannes's friend wore out his 3 bundles of switches on their backs. Never before had the troll experienced such a hailstorm. Outside the castle, he said goodbye to the princess and whispered to her, "Think of my head." The wayfarer had heard what the troll said. Just as the princess had disappeared into her bedchamber, and the troll turned to fly home, he grabbed him by his long black beard and with one stroke of his sword cut off the troll's head. He threw the body into the lake for the fishes to eat, but the ugly head he wrapped in his silk handkerchief and took it with him to the inn. Then he went to bed to sleep. The next morning, he gave the handkerchief to Johannes, but told him that he must not untie it before the princess had asked him to guess what she was thinking about. The big hall in the castle was so crowded with people that they stood as close together as radishes do when they have been bound in bunches by a farmer. The judges and the king's council were sitting in their easy chairs, resting their heads on their eider-down pillows. The king had put on a brand new robe and had had his crown and his scepter polished, which made them look very nice. But the princess was very pale and dressed in black. She looked as if she were attending a funeral. "What am I thinking about?" she asked. Johannes untied the handkerchief. He was shocked and frightened when he saw the horrible head of the troll. All the people shuddered, for it was a terrifying sight. But the princess sat as still as a stone statue and did not utter a word. At last, she rose, without looking at anyone or at anything, without turning to the left or to the right. She sighed deeply, but gave Johannes her hand and said, "Now you are my master. Tonight we shall be married." "That's what I like to hear," shouted the king. "That's the way it ought to be." Everyone shouted hurrah. The royal guards marched down the streets with a band in front of them. The church bells rang. The old ladies who sold the candy took the black crepe off their chocolate pigs. 3 oxen, stuffed with ducks and chickens, were roasted on the town square for everyone to eat. The fountains splashed the finest wine, and if you bought 2 pennies worth of pretzels, and the baker gave you 6 muffins with raisins as part of the bargain. When the evening came, the whole town was illuminated. The soldiers fired their cannons and little boys shot off firecrackers. In the castle, all the most elegant people in the country were gathered. They ate and drank and toasted each other. And all the young people danced. One could hear the young girls singing far away. But the princess was still a witch and didn't love Johannes at all. The wayfarer had not forgotten this, so he gave Johannes 3 feathers from the swan's wings and a little bottle filled with liquid, and said to him, "Tonight, next to the marriage bed, place a large tub of water and throw these feathers and empty this liquid into it. When the princess starts to get into bed, push her into the tub and duck her 3 times under the water. Then she will no longer be a witch and will love you dearly." Johannes took his friend's advice. When he shoved the princess underneath the water the first time, she screamed and changed into a black swan with fiery eyes who wiggled and strained in his grasp. The second time she was plunged into the water, she became a white swan with a black ring around her neck. Johannes prayed to God as he pushed her under the 3rd time, and instantly she changed into the most beautiful princess. She was even lovelier than before, and she thanked him, with tears in her eyes, for having broken the evil spell. The next day, the king came visiting. So did the court, and half of the people in town. They all wanted to pay their respects to the bridal couple. Last of all came Johannes's traveling companion. He had a knapsack on his back and a walking stick in his hand. Johannes kissed him and begged him not to leave. "All my good fortune is your doing," he cried. But his friend shook his head. Then he spoke softly and gently. "No, my time on earth is over. I have paid my debt. Do you remember the dead man whom the evil men wanted to harm? You gave them everything you owned, so that he could rest in his coffin. I am the dead man." With these words, he disappeared. The wedding celebration lasted a month. Johannes and his princess loved each other very much. The old king lived for many years and enjoyed having his grandchildren sit on his knee and play, while Johannes ruled the whole kingdom. The end.